I hear from a lot of people who, upon learning I graduated from high school in 1962, assume that I must be just about ready to fall off my chair and go into retirement. Excuse me. I want to be P.D. James when I grow up and have a new book when I'm 88. And based on the model of my mother and my mother's sisters, I think I have a good chance of making that goal. So don't worry about me stopping writing. I say this, characters are really hard to come up with. You have to make up all of their background. You need to know where they went to school, where did they go to church, were they from a family that was somehow disrupted. You need to know all of that stuff. And it's too hard to make it up over and over. So I'm not ready to turn loose of any of my characters. I don't know when there will be the next Beaumont or Brady book, and I don't know which one it'll be because my editor hasn't told me yet. Those decisions are made by bean counters in New York. But you can trust that as long as my fingers still work, there will be more, and I'll be back revisiting those characters again. So please do not come up and say, I say this, and then people come up and say, but you didn't say when there would be another Beaumont. Well, I don't know when there will be another Beaumont, so give me a break. There will be another Beaumont as soon as I can make one happen. I think my books have a lot of solid Midwestern values. My parents grew up in South Dakota, as my Scandahoovian relatives call it. My father was from Marvin, and my mother was from Summit, as Grandpa Anderson called it, 10 miles away. In the summer of 1935, my father went to Summit courting my mother's younger sister, Toots. And Grandpa Anderson said, I told him, Norman, in this house we eat the old bread first. Which is how my father ended up spending the next 68 years of his life with my mother Evelyn instead of with my Aunt Toots. And when we left South Dakota, all of our South Dakota relatives grieved because we were going to Arizona where we were going to die either of the heat or Apaches. And every other year we had to go from Bisbee back to South Dakota and prove to the relatives that we had not yet died. Well, what do you do on those long trips with 7 kids stacked in a car like cordwood and no radio? Well, our mother sang. She had this whole catalog of wonderful songs in her head. Oh, they cut down the old pine tree and they hauled it away to the mill to make a coffin of pine for that sweetheart of mine. They cut down the old pine tree, but she's not alone in her grave tonight. 'Tis there my heart will ever be. Though we drifted apart, still they cut down my heart when they cut down the old pine tree. And there are about 15 verses to that song. Previews of coming attractions. Next summer's book is Queen of the Night. It's the 4th in my reservation series. The stories and legends I learned during the 5 years I was a K-12 librarian on the reservation are woven into the background of all of those books. The first one was Diana Ladd's book. It's a story where she is just starting on her career of being a writer. And see, it's because in my books, things turn out the way I want them. That's how come she won a Pulitzer. But in that book, she is dealing with a serial killer who dragged her first husband, Garrison Ladd, into his net of evil. And she, Diana, years earlier, helped put that man in prison. And he has now come back bent on wreaking revenge. So Our the Hunter is Diana's book. Kiss of the Bees happens years later. Diana has been married to the detective from the first book for a very long time, and they have adopted a child who is now 16, a little Indian girl who almost died of being bitten by ants when she was a toddler. That child is Dolores Lanita Walker, and Kiss of the Bees is Lonnie's book. The third book belongs to Delia Chavez Cachorra Ortiz. And see, I have to remember all of these people and all of their maiden names and all of that other stuff. Is it a surprise that sometimes I can't remember my own name? But Delia was born on the reservation, but spent most of her life being raised on the East Coast, educated in Anglo schools, and she is working as an attorney for the BIA when the tribal chairman, a guy who has been in the first two books, Gabe Ortiz, otherwise known as Fat Crack, comes to Washington in hopes of convincing her to come home to be the tribal attorney. Somebody wrote me an email. He said, "Why did you call him Fat Crack?" I said, "Think of any plumber you've ever seen." And the guy wrote back and said, "Too much information." Well, where do you think nicknames come from? I mean, I don't make up everything. The third book, Day of the Dead, then, tells Delia's story and how she went back to the reservation and what happened to her afterwards. How do I start my books? I met outlining in Mrs. Watkins' 6th grade geography class in Bisbee, Arizona. I hated outlining then. I hate it to this day. I write murder mysteries, so I usually start with somebody dead, and then I spend the rest of the book trying to figure out who killed them and how come. And I need to make that happen inside 100,000 words, because that's how many books my publisher wants the books. They don't want them to be 107,000 words. They don't want them to be 85,000 words. 100,000 words makes a book that fits in a standard shipping box. And so I always count the words so I know how many words I've used and how many words I have left. And people think that, they think writing should be a little more artistic than that, I guess, and they're always sort of offended by the fact that I count the words. But wait a minute, what could be more artistic than the Sistine Chapel? They wanted Michelangelo to paint the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel. If he had painted outside the walls, we would be missing big parts of that picture. And so my walls are 100,000 words. And I do my best to paint inside the lines. People say, well, do you wake up in the middle of the night and write down ideas? No. If I think of an idea overnight, I don't write it down, because if it's not a good enough idea to last until morning, it's not a good enough idea to go in the book. I tried working with a view, and it didn't work for me. I spent all my life looking at the view and not paying attention to my characters. So I sit with my back turned to the view so I can keep an eye on my stories.